In this video, we'll look at first-degree price discrimination. Under first-degree price discrimination, the monopolist is able to sell every unit it sells for exactly what the consumer is willing to pay for it. So the monopolist can sell different units of output for different prices, and these prices may differ from person to person. So let's look at the diagram here. So we have a downward sloping demand curve. We have the price as usual on the vertical axis and the quantity on the horizontal axis. And we'll start by thinking about what does that demand curve actually represent. So let's think about the first unit here. So how much are consumers willing to pay for the first unit? Well, if we look at the height of the demand curve, that tells us exactly how much consumers are willing to pay. So the amount consumers are willing to pay is the height of the demand curve. But because the width of this rectangle here is 1, the area of that rectangle is also the willingness to pay. So the height of that rectangle and the area of that rectangle are the willingness to pay for the first unit. And it's similar for all the following units. So that what's the willingness to pay for the second unit? Well, again, we look for the height of the demand curve. This is the willingness to pay, or the marginal valuation, for the second unit. And if we keep going like that, you'll see that the area under the demand curve is just the willingness to pay. So this rectangle is the willingness to pay for the third unit. Now what's the willingness to pay for 3 units? Well, the first 3 units there, we just look at the total area under the demand curve. We add up the area of these 3 rectangles, and it's this area here. So you'll notice that there's this unshaded area here. So we can think of the smooth demand curve as, I guess, an approximation to this step demand curve. We usually work with smooth demand curves because we can apply calculus. So now let's think about how much would the monopoly actually want to sell. If it was going to sell 1 unit, well, what price would it sell it for? Well, it'd sell it for the willingness to pay, right? This rectangle. So this would be the revenue from that unit. If it wanted to sell 2 units, well, it would sell the first unit for this much, and the second unit for the height of this rectangle. So the revenue would be the area under the demand curve up to 2 units, and so on. And so how much would it sell? Well, the willingness to pay, the height of the demand curve, is also the marginal revenue in this case, because the monopoly is able to charge exactly what consumers are willing to pay. So the demand curve here is also marginal revenue. So this is different to the case under uniform pricing, where the marginal revenue curve was under the demand curve, because in order to sell another unit, the monopoly would have to reduce the price on all the units it was already selling. So the marginal revenue is below the demand. So how much would the monopoly sell? Well, we also need to draw the marginal cost curve. So as usual, we're going to assume that it's constant. So the marginal cost curve is horizontal. So let's label that C. This is the marginal cost. And because the demand curve is the marginal revenue curve, the monopoly will want to produce up to the point where the demand curve, the marginal revenue curve, crosses the marginal cost curve. So this happens at this point here. And this is actually the competitive quantity. So under first degree price discrimination, the monopolist would want to sell the competitive quantity. So for all these units from 0 up to QC, the marginal revenue is above the marginal cost. The monopoly can sell these units for more than their cost to produce, because the willingness to pay is above the marginal cost. But for these units, the marginal cost is above the marginal revenue. Consumers are willing to pay less for these units than it costs to produce them. So what would be the profit of the monopolist under first degree price discrimination? Well, its total revenue will be the willingness to pay for QC units, this area, and the cost will be this rectangle here, right? So we add up the costs of each of the units, we end up with the total cost, as long as there's no fixed cost. So for any marginal cost curve, the area under the marginal cost curve is the variable cost or the total cost when there's no fixed cost. So this is regardless of whether the marginal cost curve is horizontal or not. So the profit then must be this triangle between the demand curve and the marginal cost curve. So this area is profit under first degree price discrimination. There's no consumer surplus because each unit is being sold for exactly what the consumer is willing to pay. And total welfare is maximized because the output is equal to the competitive output, or more specifically, it's equal to the output where the marginal benefit of the last unit in terms of consumption is equal to the marginal cost of production. Profit here is equal to welfare. So just to summarize, first degree price discrimination maximizes welfare, and under first degree price discrimination, there's no consumer surplus.